For our second ethnographic study, we'll look at the Tiwi of Northern Australia. The Tiwi, like all native Australian cultures, were organized as bands when European colonists first arrived on the continent, and Australian natives have provided anthropologists with some of the best opportunities to study very small societies. The Tiwi themselves live on Melville and Bathurst Islands off the coast of Northern Australia, just opposite the modern city of Darwin. These two islands together encompass about 3,000 square miles, a very large area to support the several thousand Tiwi. The landscape is also very different from what Americans normally think of when they think about Australia. Rather than a desolate red desert, which is typical of the interior of the continent, Melville and Bathurst are covered with lush tropical forests. These forests support a rich and varied wildlife, as well as plentiful plant foods and resources. Heavy monsoonal rains fall from about November to April, but there is little rain at all for the rest of the year. In such a rich environment, agriculture would have offered little to the few Aboriginal inhabitants. The Tiwi, like all native Australians and all band-organized peoples, were originally hunter-gatherers, and many modern Tiwi still derive much of their diet from wild food sources. This is true even though most Tiwi have adopted more mainstream Australian styles of home, dress, and so on, as they've integrated into the modern world system in recent decades. A census in the mid-1980s set the population of the Tiwi at about 2,000, and there were probably somewhat fewer of them in earlier decades before there was much availability of European medicines and technology. This very low population, coupled with the rather large size of the Tiwi Islands and their phenomenal richness of wild foods, made for a very easy lifestyle for the Tiwi prior to European contact. Again, like all band-organized societies, the Tiwi practiced a hunting and gathering strategy of subsistence. The richness and reliability of their wild food sources meant that they could follow a foraging strategy, much like the Zhuktwasi, and there was little need to collect large stores of food for future periods of shortage. Like most hunter-gatherer societies, plant foods made up most of their diet, since plant foods are much easier to locate and gather. Let's look now at the social organization of the Tiwi. Wild food sources still required them to move through the landscape, as those sources came into and went out of season. The Tiwi divide their society into several large landowning groups, which they call countries when speaking English. Each country is responsible for taking care of the resources in a particular part of the islands, and consequently has the right to exploit those resources. A person inherits the country of his or her father. Outsiders who don't belong to the local country may gain access through marriage to someone who does belong, or simply by asking permission from an influential elder. Given the low population and large reserve of resources, there's seldom any reason to deny someone access, but there's also seldom a need to ask in the first place. Within one's country, there's usually enough food and other resources to support everyone at the standard of living they're accustomed to. The basic unit of Tiwi society is the band, or more precisely what anthropologists would call the regional band. This is a large gathering of several interrelated households, numbering about 100 people, that at certain times operates together as a unit. On a daily basis, however, the most relevant social group is not the regional band, but the local band, usually a single large household made up of a man, his wives, and their children. This is the group that moves together across the landscape, gathering food and sharing resources. This sort of loose organization, coming together at some times, dispersing at others, with all groups having a flexible membership, is comparable to what we saw with the Zhuktwasi, and indeed all band-organized societies. Where the Tiwi differ from the Zhuktwasi is in their kinship and descent rules, the rules that govern who can claim membership in which social categories. These rules are more rigid among the Tiwi than among the Zhuktwasi. Perhaps because the Tiwi landscape is richer and more productive, the need for flexibility isn't so strong there as in the Kalahari Desert. At any rate, in addition to the countries which just serve to convey land use rights, the Tiwi also divide their communities up into a series of clans, which are larger organizations of people who are all assumed to be at least distantly related to one another, although any two individuals may not be able to specify exactly how they're related. Membership in a clan is matrilineal. This means that children, both sons and daughters, are considered members of the mother's clan. When the clan comes together for ceremonies, cooperative work projects, or any other reason, children associate with their mother's extended family rather than their father's. At the same time, the father's clan is also important for the child. In addition to conveying land use rights, the father's clan must also be the clan from which one's spouse comes. This practice is called exogamy, a requirement that one's spouse belongs to a different social group than oneself. Since the Tiwi rule of exogamy requires that not only must one marry a spouse from a different clan, but specifically from the clan of one's father, this means that pairs of clans automatically intermarry with one another repeatedly. It also strengthens relationships within the clans when, as we'll see, fathers choose husbands for their daughters from the father's own clan. We come now to what is probably the most studied aspect of traditional Tiwi society, its practice of marriage. Marriage among the Tiwi has been the subject of great interest among anthropologists because it was traditionally the subject of great interest among the Tiwi themselves. Both our own culture and the Juktuasi we studied last week practice monogamy, the custom of each person, man or woman, having only a single spouse. In many cultures around the world, however, one gender is allowed to have multiple spouses simultaneously. This practice is known as polygamy, and it exists in two forms. By far, the less common form of polygamy is polyandry, where a single woman is allowed to marry multiple husbands at the same time. Much more common worldwide is polygyny, where a man is allowed to have more than one wife simultaneously. The Tiwi, like most cultures around the world, traditionally allowed polygyny, but forbade polyandry. Moreover, the Tiwi not only allowed polygyny, but created a system that outright ensured it. In most cultures, polygyny is allowed by custom, but most actual marriages are monogamous, simply because there's an equal number of men and women in the community. But in the Tiwi system, there will always be more women seeking husbands than men seeking wives, and this is ensured by integrating marriage customs with economy and politics. Before diving too far into the details, we should note that this system is no longer practiced by the modern Tiwi. Thanks to Catholic missionaries in the region in the middle part of the 20th century, most modern Tiwi are Catholic and have adopted the Christian tradition of monogamy. But before the missionizing of the Tiwi Islands, this system was not only followed, but also worked extremely well to everyone's benefit. The first and most basic principle of Tiwi marriage is that every female must be married at all times. Traditional Tiwi belief held that pregnancy could happen at any time to any woman. Making sure that all women were always married would ensure that any child would always have a recognized father. To this end, girls were betrothed to future husbands as soon as they were born. Meanwhile, boys would not start seeking spouses until they were old enough to support a household and children of their own, and they probably would not find a spouse for several years after that, for reasons we'll soon see. This meant, of course, that there were always more women in need of husbands than men in need of wives. In such a system, the sharing of husbands, that is, polygyny, makes perfect sense. Since young girls had to be betrothed, but boys of their own age weren't old enough to be potential spouses, a girl's first so-called husband would always be many years older than her. Don't misunderstand this, the Tiwi were not a society of dirty old men. Girls would still be raised by their birth parents until their mid-teens, around the age that most girls in small traditional societies are first married. Then they'd take up residence with their husbands, and their first children would usually be born a year or two after that, not too far off from the traditional customs of our own culture a century or two ago. But during that period of childhood, before the girl was acting as a wife, she was still technically married, which was enough. So how does a newborn baby girl get a husband? Her first husband would always be chosen by her father from his own clan. But because this was a marriage relationship that wouldn't form any practical familial bonds for maybe 15 years, the father usually chose a husband more for his benefit than for his daughter's. While Tiwi bands were small and egalitarian, the politics of such small groups become increasingly personal and emotional. The Tiwi have less ability to vote with their feet than the Juktuasi, since they must remain within their own country's territory. So it becomes more important that everyone can get along with everyone else. In small communities, this means a lot of personal wheeling and dealing and the giving of gifts to build close friendships and alliances. Some of those gifts are food, and some of them are wives. See, in a hunter-gatherer society, wealth is measured by how much food a family can generate. Since women do most of the gathering of plant foods, which makes up most of the diet, a man with more wives can generate more wealth. The extra food they bring in can be used as gifts to other men to generate the kinds of close relationships necessary for the community to operate smoothly. Giving another man gifts of food encourages him to think highly of you, and he's therefore more likely to betroth his daughter to you. Eventually, that daughter will become your wife and help you to generate even more wealth for your household. So in this way, polygyny works to the advantage of the Tiwi men. More wives means more wealth, which means more friends and allies, which means more influence in community politics. When a man has accumulated enough wealth and influence through this gift-giving process that he becomes a community leader, he's known as a big man. Any man with the charisma and entrepreneurial spirit can become a big man, so this is still an egalitarian form of leadership. Big men are actually much more common among tribal societies in Melanesia, just north of Australia. We'll study them in more detail when we look at the Trobriand Islands in a few weeks. Meanwhile, Tiwi women also benefited from their unique marriage system. Teenage girls, though technically married, retained a lot of independence and control over their own lives, at least until they started having children. And as young wives married to much older husbands, they were unlikely to be their husband's only wife. Senior wives would act as mentors for the younger wives, teaching them the skills necessary to gather wild foods with maximum efficiency in a kind of apprenticeship system. And since their husbands were so much older, they usually died first. A woman might find herself widowed as a teenager, at which point she would be required to remarry. But crucially, all subsequent husbands would be chosen by the woman herself. If she felt confident in her ability to support a household, she might choose to marry a relatively young man, who might still be quite a bit older than herself, and become his first wife. She would then be in primary control of the household gathering and any future junior wives. Or she might choose to attach herself to a prominent big man who already had a large, wealthy household. The big man would have little reason to refuse, and it would mean a more comfortable lifestyle for her. It was all up to her decision. Because of this system, men older than about 40 often had as many as 20 wives, and big men would continue accumulating young wives into their 70s. Men in their 30s would have one or two previously married wives, but men under 30 who had yet to prove themselves to the community often had none. Meanwhile, women might pass through several husbands over the course of their lives, moving from junior wives, just one among many, in their teens, to more and more senior wives as they aged. Again, this system is no longer practiced among the modern Tiwi, but it was practiced among them recently enough that anthropologists were able to study it carefully. The insights gained among the Tiwi have helped us to better understand polygyny in many parts of the world, even if those cultures' marriage practices aren't so extreme as the Tiwis. We've seen how marriage is integrated with economy and leadership among the Tiwi, but of course Tiwi life isn't just about counting wives. Traditional Tiwi culture also practiced a rich, if albeit rather simplified, spiritual life. Again, perhaps the richness of the Tiwi landscape meant that they didn't need to worry so much about the spiritual world, but regardless, their traditional religious beliefs were rather vague and unelaborated. They divided their cosmos into three worlds: the world of the unborn, the world of the living, and the world of the dead. Spirits moved from one to the next in order, but their lives in each were more or less the same. Religious rituals among the living Tiwi centered around avoiding taboos that caused a ritual uncleanliness, or ceremonies intended to resolve that uncleanliness. Sickness and misfortune were attributed to the violation of taboos, but seldom was this thought of in terms of punishment. That is, no deities or spirits were thought to send sickness, as some Jactoisi believe. Rather, the misfortune was simply thought to be the natural consequence of improper behavior, much as we might consider an upset stomach to be the natural consequence of eating spoiled food. Simple rituals known to most people would be enacted to resolve the problem, and the ill person would be admonished to do better in the future. There are two more important rituals practiced by the Tiwi even today. The first is the Kulama Ceremony, an initiation ceremony held once a year in which the whole regional band participates. It's at this ceremony that children are initiated into adulthood and become eligible to marry. In the past, this is when girls became eligible to take up residence with their husbands, and when boys could begin seeking wives. Though, again, it would probably take them several years to actually find their first. In addition to the initiation aspect of the ceremony for teens, Adults also participate in the Kulama Ceremony, moving to higher levels in a series of named stages, each one thought to bring good health and prosperity. The Kulama Ceremony happens once a year. Less predictable but more common is the Pukamani Ceremony. This is the traditional Tiwi funeral ritual. Tiwi believed that the spirit of the deceased remained near their bodies, and that these spirits needed to be convinced to move on to the world of the dead. To this end, the various rituals and taboos surrounding the dead are designed to both comfort the deceased and to make him or her feel less connected to the living. Close family enter a ritually unclean state, painting their faces and bodies with special designs meant to disguise them from their deceased loved ones. The deceased's possessions are all deposited at the gravesite, and his or her name becomes taboo. After a period of mourning lasting perhaps several months, the spirit is assumed to have moved on, and these ritual restrictions are lifted. One final important component of the Pukamani ceremony needs to be mentioned, however, and that is the Pukamani Poles. These are elaborately carved and painted poles, each one unique, set up around the gravesite during the funeral. They're commissioned by the family and made to specially reflect the personality of the deceased. These both mark the now taboo gravesite and, it's thought, encourage the spirit to stay nearby rather than wandering back to the settlement. Pukamani poles, or more precisely poles made in that style, have become highly prized works of art on the international art market. While it is considered offensive to sell actual Pukamani poles used in funerals, the artists who make them are free to make and sell similar works to anyone willing to pay. This is one of the major sources of income and prestige for the modern Tiwi, who've taken careful control of the ways that their traditional art is used by outside groups. So after examining the Tiwi culture, we can see that there's much that they hold in common with the Jukwasi, hunting and gathering, egalitarianism, etc. But they're also very different in other ways. All band societies are not interchangeable, but their small scale allows anthropologists to gain insights into the complexity of everyday life.